There are moments when a familiar life loses its explanation. The train still arrives, the office opens, dinner is prepared, and tomorrow remains on the calendar. Yet the reasons that once held these actions together no longer seem guaranteed. We ask the world for an account of itself, and the world does not answer in a language we can recognize. Albert Camus gave a precise name to this encounter. He called it the absurd. The word can sound comic, chaotic, or merely strange. For Camus, it named something more exact, the collision between our longing for clarity and a world that offers no final assurance of purpose. His question was not whether life occasionally feels pointless. It was how a lucid person should live when no ultimate meaning can be proved. That question led him first toward suicide, then toward freedom, and finally toward the harder problem of political murder. Camus refused two conclusions that often appear to follow from meaninglessness. He refused the thought that one should end one's own life. He also refused the thought that, without eternal values, any killing can be justified by a promised future. Between those refusals, he tried to build an ethic of revolt, solidarity, limits, and measured action. The structure was never complete. Its gaps matter, especially where his principles met the colonial history of Algeria, the land of his birth. This documentary follows the movement of that unfinished thought through essays, novels, journalism, and political conflict. It will keep Meursault and Jean-Baptiste Clement separate from their creator, distinguish Camus from conventional existentialism, and treat his critics as part of the story. The central question is simple to state and difficult to live. How can we inhabit a universe without guaranteed meaning, while refusing both suicide and political murder? Camus's answer begins in a childhood where poverty, mortality, sea, and sunlight were never far apart. Part 1. A childhood between poverty and light. Albert Camus was born in 1913 near Mondovi, in French-ruled Algeria, in a settler society organized by deep legal and political inequality. His family belonged to the European population, later commonly called the Pieds Noirs. That status brought privileges denied to colonized Arab and Amazigh Algerians. It did not make the family prosperous. Camus's father, Lucien, worked in the wine trade and was mobilized soon after the First World War began. He died from wounds received at the Battle of the Marne before his younger son could know him. Camus grew up in the working-class Belcourt district of Algiers with his mother, brother, grandmother, and an uncle. His mother, Catherine, cleaned houses and did factory work. She was partially deaf, had little formal education, and spoke sparingly. The household's poverty was material and immediate. It was also surrounded by heat, streets, football grounds, sea, and sky. Later writing returned to that combination. Deprivation without romantic disguise, and physical beauty that did not cancel deprivation. This double inheritance helps explain why Camus rarely treated happiness as a theory. It arrived through bodies in a finite world. A primary school teacher, Louis Germain, recognized Camus' ability and helped him compete for a scholarship. Education opened a route that family income alone could not have supplied. Camus never forgot the intervention. After receiving the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1957, he wrote to Germain with gratitude. The story can be sentimentalized too easily. What matters philosophically is more specific. A person's possibilities depended on institutions, chance, and another person's attention. Freedom was real, but it was never created from nothing by an isolated will. At school, Camus loved football and played as a goalkeeper. In adolescence, he developed tuberculosis, an illness that repeatedly interrupted his studies, work, travel, and athletic hopes. The disease made mortality bodily rather than abstract. It also taught him that plans can be narrowed by facts no act of will removes. He continued at the University of Algiers, studying philosophy and writing a thesis on relations between Greek thought and early Christianity, especially Plotinus and Augustine. Yet his mature work would resist philosophy conducted far from weather, illness, labor, and death. The young Camus entered theatre and journalism. He briefly joined the Algerian Communist Party during the 1930s, when anti-fascism and opposition to colonial injustice drew many young intellectuals toward the left. He later broke with the party amid conflicts involving its changing line on Algerian nationalism. The episode does not reduce to an early error followed by mature wisdom. It introduced a problem that stayed with him. Organizations can demand that concrete loyalties submit to strategic history. They can also give otherwise scattered people the power to act together. In 1939, reporting for Alger Republicain, Camus published a series on severe poverty and hunger in Kabylia. He described inadequate schools, medical care, wages, and food, and condemned the conditions imposed on the region's inhabitants. This journalism is important evidence against the idea that he was indifferent to colonial suffering. It is not sufficient evidence that he escaped colonial assumptions. He criticized abuses with urgency while stopping short of rejecting the political framework that produced them. That distinction will return when Algeria's struggle for independence tests his language of justice and limits. War transformed his scale of experience. Camus moved between Algeria and France, worked in newspapers, and joined the resistance newspaper Combat, eventually becoming one of its leading editorial voices. The occupation, organized killing, collaboration, and liberation placed individual absurdity beside collective catastrophe. The writer who had asked whether one person should continue living now faced states and movements that killed in the name of destiny. His philosophy would move from the lonely consciousness toward shared rebellion, but it would never entirely leave the sunlight and silence of Algeria behind. At Combat, principle met the unstable days after liberation. Camus initially defended severe justice for major collaborators in a public disagreement with the Catholic writer François Mauriac, who urged clemency. As the purge unfolded, Camus moved closer to Mauriac's caution and acknowledged that the older writer had seen something he had not. The change is important. Measure was not always a wisdom Camus possessed in advance. Sometimes it emerged from recognizing that a confident judgment had outrun events. This biography explains some pressures on Camus' thought, but it cannot prove the thought. Poverty does not automatically yield solidarity. Illness does not guarantee lucidity. Resistance does not settle the ethics of violence. His life gave him materials and loyalties, along with blind spots. To understand what he made from them, we need the intellectual crisis of his generation. A Europe in which religious certainty, rational progress, and political history had all become difficult to trust. Part 2. The Age That Broke Its Promises. Camus came of age amid the ruins of several promises. Traditional Christianity still shaped European culture, but its authority no longer supplied a common answer to suffering and death. 19th century faith in rational progress had been darkened by industrialized war. Revolutionary movements promised emancipation, yet the Soviet state showed how a politics of liberation could produce camps, purges, censorship, and official lies. Fascism turned myth, nation, and violence into instruments of rule. The problem was not an empty universe alone. It was a crowded world of competing absolutes. Several thinkers helped define this landscape. Kierkegaard had explored anxiety, despair, and the leap of faith. Nietzsche announced the cultural consequences of the death of God and asked how values might be created afterward. Dostoevsky dramatized rebellion, guilt, faith, and the permission that may seem to follow when no divine law commands us. Husserl pursued certainty through phenomenology, the careful study of experience. Kafka presented worlds where authority is pervasive and explanation recedes. Camus read these writers as companions and opponents, not as steps toward a system of his own. Greek tragedy offered another inheritance. Its conflicts often place valid claims against one another without providing an innocent resolution. A law of the city may collide with a duty to family. Justice may summon a revenge that creates new guilt. Camus's language of contradiction and measure belongs partly to this tragic form. It asks us to act even when action leaves a remainder. This differs from saying that every side is equal. Tragedy makes responsibility heavier because no final harmony arrives to absorb the cost. He is often placed beside existentialists because they shared a family of concerns: mortality, freedom, anxiety, responsibility, and the individual confronting a world without ready-made purpose. Camus was close to Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir during the 1940s. Sartre's fiction and philosophy mattered to him. Still, Camus repeatedly declined the existentialist label. He did not build an ontology like Sartre's, and he resisted the idea that his work began from the same premises and reached the same politics. Calling him an existentialist can be useful only if the word remains qualified. Camus's method was closer to description, essay, image, and dramatic test. He began with experiences in which ordinary arrangements lose their necessity. Repetition suddenly appears as repetition. A familiar room becomes strange. The certainty that other people die turns into the knowledge that we will die. Reason can explain many causes, but a complete explanation of why existence should be here at all remains unavailable. These moments do not demonstrate a cosmic theorem. They disclose a tension between what consciousness asks and what the world provides. That distinction is essential. Camus did not say that the world itself contains a substance called absurdity, nor did he locate absurdity only inside a gloomy person. If human longing disappeared, there would be no demand for meaning. If the world supplied transparent and final purpose, there would be no silence. The absurd arises in their relation. It is the friction between the wish for unity and the limits of answer. Removing either side removes the particular conflict Camus wants to preserve. This is why cheerful advice to invent a personal meaning does not fully capture his position. A chosen project may organize a life, and Camus valued work, love, friendship, art, and political commitment. Yet none becomes a proof that the universe intended us or guarantees the value we give it. Meaning at the human scale is possible. Metaphysical reconciliation remains unearned. Camus asks us to resist converting a useful commitment into a final explanation, because that conversion hides the very condition from which honest action must begin. He was equally wary of despair becoming a doctrine. To say that no ultimate meaning can be established is not to say that every experience has equal human value. It does not show that kindness and cruelty are interchangeable, or that pain is unreal. Those moral conclusions require further argument. Indeed, much of Camus' career can be read as an effort to discover what follows and what does not follow from metaphysical uncertainty. The effort is compelling partly because he never solves every step. His early essays in Nuptials celebrate sea, stone, heat, desire, and the present body. They provide a counterweight to any image of Camus as a prophet of grey futility. Awareness of death intensifies the finite day because the day will not be repeated forever. Yet celebration has a danger. A beautiful landscape can seem to stand outside history even when people within it live under unequal laws. Camus's Mediterranean sensibility carries both a genuine love of finite life and a temptation to make political conflict dissolve into elemental light. The age, therefore, gave him two linked tasks. He had to resist consolations that denied absurdity, and he had to resist the nihilism that turned uncertainty into permission. The first task shaped the myth of Sisyphus. The second shaped the rebel. Between them stand novels whose characters reveal more ambiguity than an argument can contain. The first of these, The Stranger, places an emotionally opaque man before a court hungry for a coherent story. Part 3. The Stranger and the Trial of Meaning. The Stranger opens with news of a mother's death and a narrator whose language refuses the expected signs of grief. Myrsalt travels to the home where she had lived, sits through the vigil, notices fatigue, coffee, light, and other people's faces, then returns to Algiers. Soon he swims, begins a relationship with Marie, and becomes entangled with a violent neighbor named Raymond. On a beach, in oppressive heat and glare, he kills an Arab man whose name the novel never gives us. It is a serious mistake to treat Myrsalt as Camus speaking without disguise. A fictional first-person voice is a constructed perspective, not an authorial confession. Myrsalt often inhabits immediate sensation without reflecting on its moral or social meaning. Camus uses the narrowness of that voice to create both clarity and disturbance. The sentences report surfaces with apparent simplicity. What they omit accumulates around them. The mother's inner life, Marie's needs, the victim's history, and the colonial structure that makes some lives easier to leave unnamed. The novel's second half turns from crime to judgment. At Myrsalt's trial, the prosecution treats his conduct at his mother's funeral as evidence of a monstrous character. The court wants a chain of motive, remorse, and moral identity. Myrsalt cannot or will not provide one in the accepted form. The proceeding, therefore, becomes a trial of intelligibility. Society punishes the killing, but it also punishes a man who failed to perform the emotions through which society recognizes membership. The trial also turns contingency into narrative certainty. Separate details, such as cigarettes, coffee, a cinema visit, and an unconventional response to marriage, are arranged as though they reveal one fixed essence. Courts must interpret actions, but interpretation can become overconfident when every fact is made to point in the same direction. Camus exposes this hunger for coherence without suggesting that legal judgment can disappear. The problem is how to judge an act without pretending to know the whole person. This does not make him an innocent victim of conformity. He killed a person. Any reading that celebrates his authenticity while forgetting the dead man repeats the novel's most troubling exclusion. Myrsalt's honesty is also incomplete. He may refuse to lie about love or grief, yet candor about his own sensations does not equal attention to another person. Camus separates social hypocrisy from moral responsibility without neatly reconnecting them. The gap is one reason the book remains unsettled rather than exemplary. Awaiting execution, Myrsalt confronts mortality more consciously. He rejects the chaplain's religious assurance and recognizes that death is common to every life, even if its timing differs. The world's indifference, which once seemed merely sensory, becomes an explicit horizon. In this limited sense, he resembles Camus' absurd figure, stripped of appeal, present to a fate that cannot be escaped. But the clarity arrives after an act the narrative cannot morally absorb. Consciousness does not undo harm. The title offers another ambiguity. Myrsalt is a stranger to conventional emotional language, to reflective self-knowledge, and perhaps to his own actions. At the same time, The colonized Arab is made stranger within the novel's field. Post-colonial critics, most influentially Edward Said and later scholars, have argued that this absence cannot be treated as accidental background. French Algeria was not a neutral Mediterranean stage. It was a political order in which European settlers possessed citizenship and power denied to most indigenous inhabitants. A defender may answer that the victim's anonymity exposes mieux-sens and the colonial society's moral blindness. Yet the text gives little independent life from which the victim can be seen as more than an absence. The interpretive question remains disputed. Does the novel criticize colonial erasure, reproduce it, or do both at once? A careful account should resist the convenience of choosing only the answer most flattering to Camus. A work can diagnose dehumanization while still being limited by it. The Stranger, therefore, complicates any simple movement from absurdity to freedom. Mieux-sens' refusal of false feeling has a kind of integrity, but integrity narrowed to the self becomes morally thin. The court's demand for a tidy soul is coercive, but the failure of that demand does not erase responsibility. Mortality equalizes everyone in one respect, but political institutions distribute vulnerability unequally. These tensions will eventually force Camus to move beyond the solitary person. Before that movement, the Myth of Sisyphus asks its severe opening question. If our desire for ultimate meaning meets no answer, why continue living? Camus distinguishes two ways of escaping the confrontation: ending the person who asks, or ending the question by leaping into a certainty reason has not earned. He calls the first physical suicide and the second philosophical suicide. Part 4. Two Kinds of Suicide. The Myth of Sisyphus was published in 1942, the same year as The Stranger. Its historical setting matters. Camus developed it amid war, displacement, illness, and European disaster. Yet the essay is not a clinical study of suicidal states, and its argument should never be mistaken for suicide prevention or mental health care. Philosophical discussion cannot replace immediate human support, professional help, or emergency services when a person may be in danger. Camus addresses a question about logical consequence, not the full medical and personal realities of crisis. His first challenge is directed at a tempting inference. If life lacks an ultimate purpose, perhaps life is not worth living. Camus denies that the conclusion follows. Ending one's life does not answer absurdity. It removes one term of the relation. The person's demand disappears, and with it, the confrontation. Suicide would be a confession that the absurd has settled the issue, when the absurd, properly understood, names an unresolved tension. Camus chooses to sustain that tension through continued consciousness. The abstract vocabulary can hide how different real crises are. Despair may be shaped by depression, trauma, isolation, pain, debt, discrimination, or illness, none of which is answered by calling for greater lucidity. Camus' philosophical distinction remains narrow. Lack of cosmic meaning is not, by itself, a reasoned command to die. A humane use of the distinction adds care rather than blame. It protects time for circumstances to change and for another person to help carry what thought alone cannot carry. This is less a proof than a commitment. Critics rightly observe that Camus does not derive an obligation to live from neutral premises. Someone could accept his description of the absurd and reject his preference for confrontation. His rhetoric sometimes treats endurance as courage and suicide as evasion, language that can become unjust toward people in unbearable distress. The strongest version of his position is more modest. Meaninglessness alone supplies no logical verdict against life. It leaves the question open, and openness permits further experience. The second escape is philosophical suicide. Camus applies this provocative term to thinkers who begin with uncertainty, contradiction, or the limits of reason, then make a leap toward transcendence or total explanation. He discusses religious existentialists such as Kierkegaard and Lev Shestov, and he challenges aspects of Husserl's phenomenology. In Camus's reading, they sacrifice the lucid intellect to the very mystery it discovered, turning the failure of rational completion into grounds for a new certainty. The accusation needs caution. Kierkegaard did not present faith as an ordinary deduction, and religious belief contains intellectual traditions far richer than a frightened escape from death. Husserl's project cannot fairly be reduced to a disguised theology. Camus reads complex thinkers through the narrow question he has set. His category is illuminating when it identifies the wish to make uncertainty vanish. It becomes unfair when it assumes in advance that every faith or metaphysics is psychologically dishonest. Camus also uses hope in a specialized and sometimes unstable way. He objects to hope when it transfers the value of present life to another world or a final historical future. He does not reject every expectation that tomorrow may improve, every plan, or every confidence in another person. The plague depends on practical hope that effort can reduce suffering. The distinction is between finite hope, answerable to evidence and revision, and an absolute hope that justifies present sacrifice through guaranteed redemption. Once both escapes are refused, Camus draws three consequences: revolt, freedom, and passion. Revolt means the continuous refusal to let absurdity close the question. Freedom means release from living for a cosmic plan, though never release from bodily and social conditions. Passion means breadth and intensity of experience, not constant excitement. These consequences sound affirmative, but the path between them is not deductively secure. Camus often persuades by image and cadence where a systematic philosopher would demand additional premises. His refusal, nevertheless, protects something valuable. It prevents metaphysical uncertainty from becoming a verdict of personal worthlessness. A universe without a certified purpose does not say that a particular person is disposable. Silence is not condemnation. It also prevents a doctrine from claiming that suffering is secretly necessary within a perfect design. Camus keeps the wound of unanswered suffering open because premature explanation can become a way of ceasing to notice it. The essay's most famous image gathers these claims into a myth. Sisyphus does not receive a new purpose, escape the mountain, or discover that the stone was beneficial all along. He returns to his labor with consciousness. To understand why Camus imagines him happy, we must clear away the motivational slogan that later culture has built around him. The distinction between physical and philosophical suicide becomes clearer when we notice what both have in common. Each is a response to a gap between the desire for intelligibility and a world that does not provide a final answer. Physical suicide removes the person who experiences the gap. Philosophical suicide removes the gap by placing a certainty over it. One ends the questioner, while the other ends the question. Camus refuses both endings because he believes the unresolved relation itself is where an honest life begins. The absurd is not a substance hidden in the universe. It appears in the encounter between a questioning consciousness and an order that remains silent about ultimate purpose. This is why Camus does not advise a person to cultivate despair. Despair can become another total explanation, as though disappointment had finally revealed the secret of everything. The absurd is more limited. It says that the demand for a complete justification has not been satisfied. It does not say that affection is unreal, that a meal has no taste, that work has no consequence, or that suffering deserves indifference. A person can lack a cosmic guarantee while still having reasons that arise within a life. The absence of an eternal court does not make a promise weightless to the person who trusted it. It may make responsibility more immediate because no later harmony can be assumed to repair what is neglected now. Philosophical suicide is therefore tempting in forms that do not initially look religious. A political doctrine can promise that history will reconcile every sacrifice. A theory of progress can turn present victims into necessary material for a radiant future. A private romance can be asked to give a whole life the unity that metaphysics once supplied. Even despair can offer a kind of refuge when it says that nothing matters and therefore no difficult judgment is required. In each case, uncertainty is exchanged for a total frame. Camus asks what happens if the frame is withheld and decisions still have to be made. The answer is not passive indecision. Lucidity is a discipline of proportion. It distinguishes what is known from what is hoped, what is endured from what is justified, and what a person can promise from what no one can guarantee. Such proportion is emotionally demanding because human beings do not live by evidence alone. We imagine completion. We want losses to belong to a pattern. We want goodness to be protected by the structure of reality. Camus does not mock these wants. His severity lies in refusing to treat the wants as proof. There is also a social dimension to the refusal. When ultimate certainty is claimed, disagreement can become evidence of corruption rather than a reason for conversation. Someone who doubts the final answer appears not merely mistaken, but dangerous to salvation, history, or the movement. By keeping the question open, absurd thought places a limit on what one person may demand from another in the name of an invisible conclusion. It cannot remove conflict, but it weakens the excuse that cruelty is permitted because the ending is already known. The two suicides thus illuminate Camus' wider ethics. To remain alive without appeal is to keep experience available for correction. It is to admit that a judgment may be necessary without pretending it has become absolute. A person acts, loves, refuses, and accepts consequences within a horizon that remains unfinished. That unfinished quality is not a defect waiting for philosophy to repair. For Camus, it is the condition under which freedom, solidarity, and measure become real tasks rather than conclusions supplied in advance. Part 5. Sisyphus without the slogan. In Greek myth, Sisyphus is condemned to push a stone up a mountain, watch it fall, and repeat the labor without completion. Modern retellings often turn him into an emblem of persistence. Keep pushing, work harder, find meaning in effort. Camus' figure is less reassuring. The punishment remains punishment. The task produces no cumulative achievement, and no hidden judge reveals that endurance was a test. The force of the image depends on refusing to improve the conditions in imagination. Camus concentrates on the descent when Sisyphus walks back toward the stone. During that interval, he is conscious of his fate. Consciousness cannot remove the weight, but it changes the relation to it. The gods can command the action. They cannot make him inwardly consent to their interpretation. He knows the full boundary of his situation and claims the time that remains within it. His revolt is renewed because it never achieves final victory. The famous closing instruction, "One must imagine Sisyphus happy," is therefore not a report that repetitive suffering feels pleasant. Happiness here is severe and paradoxical. It includes lucidity, ownership of one's attention, and refusal of appeal. Sisyphus has no future in which the labor is redeemed. The present becomes all the more exact. Camus's happiness is compatible with fatigue and bitterness. It is the fullness of consciousness within limits, not a smile pasted over pain. The wording asks us to imagine because the myth cannot verify Sisyphus's inner state. Camus creates an interpretive possibility, not psychological evidence. That imaginative act reveals the essay's method. Where logic reaches a boundary, art proposes a figure whose meaning remains contestable. The figure may persuade us to see consciousness as a form of resistance, but another reader may imagine anger, numbness, or grief. The myth remains useful when it invites this disagreement instead of closing it. This reading explains why the stone cannot stand for every hardship in the same way. Some burdens should be removed, shared, or politically opposed. A worker exploited by an employer does not need a myth teaching contentment with exploitation. A patient needs treatment, not admiration for endurance. Camus's image concerns unalterable features of the human condition, especially mortality and the absence of final explanation. When applied to preventable injustice, it can become an ideology of resignation, the opposite of revolt. Even at the existential level, an objection remains. Why should conscious scorn make Sisyphus master of anything important? The mountain still determines his movement, calling the fate his own risks decorating powerlessness. Camus answers indirectly. Mastery is not control of events. It is the refusal to add false consent or false hope to necessity. This inner margin may be small, but it prevents external conditions from defining the whole meaning of a consciousness. Yet the language of inner freedom can exaggerate what oppressed or traumatized people can choose. Attention, emotion, and interpretation are shaped by health, history, fear, and material conditions. Camus knew bodily limitation through tuberculosis, but his absurd heroes can appear unusually self-contained. Later work improves on this solitude by locating freedom in common resistance. A person may need others not only to change the mountain, but to preserve the capacity to see it clearly. Sisyphus also represents an artist. Each created form will pass, each audience will disappear, and no work completes the world. Still, making something gives shape to experience without proving a cosmic design. Camus admired creation that knew its limits. The artist repeats the human gesture of arranging what cannot be finally explained. Unlike the god's punishment, however, art can be shared. Its temporary form becomes a meeting place between separate lives. The myth is best preserved in its tension. If we make it cheerful, we lose its honesty. If we make it hopeless, we lose its revolt. Sisyphus neither escapes nor surrenders. He occupies the interval between the two. That interval becomes Camus' first model of a life without appeal, a life that refuses a final answer yet continues to choose its manner of attention. From this image, Camus turns toward freedom and passion. But these words can be misunderstood as permission for appetite or detachment from consequences. A finite life does not make every experience equally worthy. The question is how freedom without cosmic instruction might become disciplined enough to meet other people. Part 6. Freedom, Passion, and the Present. For Camus, absurd freedom begins when the hope of a guaranteed destiny loses authority. If there is no eternal script, a person need not arrange every present hour as preparation for a final judgment. This does not create unlimited choice. Bodies age, laws constrain, money opens and closes possibilities, and other people make legitimate claims. Absurd freedom is primarily a change in orientation. We stop asking whether an action fits the universe's secret purpose and ask what it does within the life we can know. Camus sometimes writes as if quantity of experience replaces moral quality. The Myth of Sisyphus considers figures such as the actor, the lover, and the conqueror, each living through multiple roles or encounters without appeal to eternity. These portraits belong to their period and carry obvious limits. The Don Juan figure, in particular, can treat other people as occasions for his intensity. A life crowded with experiences is not necessarily freer or better than a quiet life of faithful attention. The more defensible idea is not accumulation but presence. Mortality gives choices a contour. A friendship matters partly because time together is finite. Work can absorb us without becoming our immortal justification. Pleasure need not pretend to be permanent before it becomes real. Grief likewise requires no place in a providential plan to deserve recognition. Camus's present is neither frantic consumption nor passive mindfulness. It is the scale at which consequences can be encountered without being excused by eternity. Ordinary commitments show how finite meaning differs from cosmic meaning. Keeping a promise does not explain existence, but it changes another person's day. Learning a craft does not defeat death, but it enlarges attention and competence. Caring for a place does not make the place permanent. These goods need no hidden infinity. Their limits are part of their character, and their effects can be discussed with people who hold different metaphysical beliefs. This view alters the meaning of agency. We do not create ourselves from nothing, and Camus never developed Sartre's strong account of freedom. Agency appears through response, the manner in which a given condition is inhabited, resisted, or shared. Sisyphus cannot choose the mountain. Dr. Rieu in The Plague cannot choose a world without disease. They can refuse the interpretation that nothing matters because complete victory is impossible. Action becomes local, repetitive, and answerable. There is a risk of presentism. Some injustices require long planning, institutions, and sacrifice for people not yet born. Suspicion of historical salvation must not shrink ethics to what can be felt today. Camus' mature idea of limits can support durable work if limits are understood as methods of accountability. A movement may pursue distant reform while refusing to treat living people as raw material. The future matters, but it cannot appear in court to forgive what is done in its name. Passion, then, is intensity governed by finitude. It values the sensuous world, intellectual attention, love, craft, and resistance because they are mortal. Camus' Mediterranean imagery gives this stance warmth: sea, water, stone, noon, a human body moving through light. The imagery resists philosophies that treat embodiment as a prison. Yet bodily joy should not be made into a universal temperament. Pain, disability, exhaustion, and deprivation change how the present can be lived without making a life less valuable. Camus's early ethics remains incomplete because it begins with an individual who protects lucid experience. Why should that person care about another's freedom? The absurd is shared, in fact, since all human beings confront mortality and incomplete knowledge, but shared conditions do not automatically produce solidarity. People often respond to vulnerability by dominating others. Camus needs a new starting point, one located not in private consciousness but in the moment someone says no to humiliation. That development marks the passage from the Myth of Sisyphus to the Rebel. The first book asks why we should not kill ourselves. The second asks why we should not kill others. The bridge is Revolt. A refusal that seems personal reveals an implicit claim about what no person should be forced to endure. The solitary voice discovers a plural grammar. Part 7. The Rebel's First No. The Rebel, published in 1951, begins not with a theory of government, but with a gesture. A person who has endured commands suddenly says no. The refusal establishes a boundary, up to this point, but no farther. At first, the gesture may seem purely negative. Yet Camus argues that every serious no contains a yes. The rebel affirms that something within the self should not be violated, something valuable enough to risk punishment in its defense. The example Camus uses is a slave who turns against a master's command. The language belongs to a long philosophical tradition, and its abstraction can hide the historical realities of slavery. Its conceptual purpose is nevertheless clear. If the rebel objected only from private preference, there would be no reason to resist at great risk. Revolt makes a claim that exceeds comfort. It says that a limit has been crossed, and that the limit concerns a dignity others could also possess. This is the basis of Camus' compressed formula, I revolt, therefore we are. The sentence answers Descartes' solitary starting point with a social one. In rebellion, the individual discovers a value held in common. A worker who refuses degradation does not merely say that this treatment displeases this particular worker. The refusal implies that a person should not be treated entirely as an instrument. Solidarity appears inside the act before it becomes an organization or program. The implied community may even include the person being resisted. If the oppressor is treated as less than human, the rebel has abandoned the universality of the limit. This does not mean preserving the oppressor's power or avoiding punishment. It means distinguishing a person from the domination that must end. The distinction is difficult, particularly after severe harm, but it explains why Camus links revolt to restraints on humiliation, torture, and execution. The movement from I to we is appealing, but it is not automatic. A rebel may defend the honor of a narrow group while denying the humanity of outsiders. Nationalist and racist movements also speak of violated dignity. Resentment can create intense bonds without creating universal solidarity. Camus needs an additional principle. The limit asserted against the oppressor must also restrain the rebel. If dignity belongs to us because it belongs to human beings, we cannot coherently deny it to an enemy whenever denial becomes useful. Revolt, therefore, differs from revenge. Revenge wants the offender to suffer in return and may seek an inverted domination. Revolt, at its best, wants the condition of humiliation to end. The difference is rarely pure in actual movements. Anger carries memory, grief, and the wish to make someone answer. Camus does not ask for emotionless resistance. He asks whether anger can remain faithful to the value that made it justified. The rebel's method becomes a test of the rebel's claim. This self-limitation is difficult because oppression already uses force. A refusal that never risks conflict may leave domination untouched. Camus knew resistance to occupation could not be reduced to polite disagreement. He did not establish an absolute pacifism in which every use of force is equally wrong. His position is tragic. Violence may become unavoidable, yet it never becomes innocent or sacred. Those who use it must accept responsibility, restrict it, and refuse to turn necessity into a general permission. The distinction can sound morally serious while remaining politically vague. How much force is necessary? Who decides that a limit has been reached? What institutions review the decision? Camus supplies attitudes more readily than procedures. He favors open speech, pluralism, independent labor movements, abolition of capital punishment, and reforms that reduce suffering without claiming final perfection. These commitments suggest institutions of correction, but the rebel does not offer a complete political design. Nor does shared mortality by itself prove equality. Every person dies, yet some societies make certain deaths premature, invisible, or ordinary. Solidarity must attend to those differences, or it becomes a consoling generality. Camus is strongest when the common condition intensifies attention to concrete injustice. He is weakest when universal language glides above the unequal histories through which people meet. The colonial setting of Algeria will reveal this fault with particular force. Still, the first no changes the architecture of his thought. Absurdity no longer belongs to the solitary mind facing cosmic silence. It appears whenever a human being is treated as though no answer were owed. Revolt brings value into view without claiming that value was written into the stars. It is discovered through resistance and tested through reciprocity. The next question is how such fragile solidarity looks when catastrophe becomes ordinary work. For that, Camus turns to the sealed city of the plague. Part 8. The Plague and the Work of Solidarity. The Plague was published in 1947 and set in Oran, an Algerian port rendered with deliberate plainness. Rats emerge, illness spreads, gates close, and citizens become exiles inside their own city. The novel can be read as a story of epidemic disease, as an allegory of the Nazi occupation, and as a broader study of recurring human calamity. None of these readings cancels the others. Camus gives the disaster a physical form while allowing it to signify habits of denial, domination, and collective fear. Dr. Bernard Rieu is the novel's steady center. He does not possess a theory that explains suffering. He diagnoses, visits patients, organizes treatment, and continues when results remain uncertain. Jean Theroux helps form volunteer sanitary teams. The journalist Raymond Rambert initially seeks escape so he can reunite with the woman he loves, then chooses to stay and assist. Father Paneloux interprets the plague through Christian faith, though his certainty is strained by what he witnesses. Cottard, already alienated from ordinary society, flourishes amid general crisis. Theroux's history joins plague to political killing. He recalls discovering that his father, a prosecutor, could demand a defendant's death in the calm language of law. Theroux then sought causes opposed to execution and eventually recognized that movements of liberation could carry their own plague. His wish is to become innocent without ceasing to act. Camus treats the wish tenderly while showing its impossibility. Theroux can reduce harm, share danger, and refuse certain means, but he cannot stand wholly outside the systems he opposes. These characters do not represent simple moral labels. Rambert's desire for private happiness is understandable, and his eventual solidarity would mean little if leaving had never tempted him. Paneloux is not dismissed as a cartoon of religion. His interpretations change under pressure. Theroux's pursuit of innocence is admirable and impossible. Rieu's practical decency is not emotional emptiness. The novel asks what people do when no available position is pure and no outcome can be guaranteed. The sanitary teams embody Camus' mature revolt. Their work is repetitive, local, and insufficient. They do not defeat mortality. They reduce particular suffering, record what happens, and refuse consent to preventable death. Heroism would almost be the wrong category because it makes ordinary responsibility sound exceptional. Camus emphasizes a common decency that can be practiced without believing oneself morally grand. The work matters even when applause, purity, and final victory are absent. Here the absurd acquires a social answer. The plague is indifferent, but people need not imitate its indifference. No cosmic meaning descends upon the city. Meaning arises provisionally in care, accurate speech, friendship, and shared labor. This is not the cheerful manufacture of a private purpose. The teams are answerable to suffering outside themselves. Their commitment gains weight from its object, not merely from the intensity with which they choose it. The narrator's role also matters. Rieu eventually reveals that he has assembled testimonies in order to bear witness. Recording prevents the dead and the workers from disappearing into a triumphant public story. When the gates reopen, celebration is genuine, but the ending does not certify permanent deliverance. The plague bacillus can remain dormant and return. Politically, fascism may return. Existentially, vulnerability never left. Memory becomes part of resistance because forgetting prepares the next denial. Yet the novel's universalism has a striking boundary. Oran is a colonial city, but Arab inhabitants scarcely appear as developed agents. A book about shared catastrophe largely imagines its collective through European characters. One can argue that the allegorical design intentionally strips away local politics. That answer exposes the problem rather than resolving it. The supposedly universal city has been built from a selective population. Common suffering becomes easier to proclaim when unequal citizenship remains outside the frame. There is also a danger in the plague metaphor. An occupying army or political movement consists of human agents, not microbes. Calling evil a disease can obscure decisions, interests, and responsibility. It may also encourage fantasies of cleansing. Camus avoids the worst version because his characters know that everyone carries the capacity for harm, and because the response is care, truth, and limits, not purification. Still, historical analysis requires distinctions an allegory cannot supply. What survives these objections is a model of action without metaphysical guarantee. Ryu does not wait to know that history will vindicate him. He does not calculate whether kindness will permanently solve the human condition. He works because a suffering person is present and a response is possible. The modest scale is not small in effort. It is small in its claim to innocence and final knowledge. The plague brings the I into a working we. The rebel asks what happens when that we seeks to transform society. Sanitary work can organize around a clear harm. Political revolution faces institutions, enemies, competing goods, and time. The danger begins when a limited refusal becomes a total account of history, and when today's victims are asked to authorize tomorrow's executioners. The moral force of the plague comes partly from its refusal to make decency spectacular. The central work is repetitive. Records are kept, patients are visited, teams are organized, rules are followed, and exhaustion returns the next morning. This rhythm matters because catastrophe often produces a hunger for exceptional gestures. People imagine that courage must arrive as a pure moment in which fear disappears. Camus offers something less dramatic and more durable. Courage can be the decision to perform an ordinary duty while fear, doubt, and resentment remain present. Dr. Ryu does not need a complete theory of evil before treating a fever. The urgency of another person's body interrupts the demand for metaphysical certainty. This does not solve the philosophical problem. It changes its scale. Instead of asking whether the universe ultimately vindicates care, one asks what care requires in this room with these limited supplies during this hour. The answer may be incomplete, but incompleteness is not the same as meaninglessness. A bandage has a local meaning even if history has no final destination. The novel also shows why solidarity cannot be reduced to warm feeling. People in Oran are separated by quarantine, private longing, social position, and different interpretations of the epidemic. Some deny the danger because acknowledging it would rearrange their plans. Some seek personal escape. Some turn suffering into a sermon. Others join the sanitary teams without claiming unusual virtue. Solidarity appears when a shared vulnerability is translated into practices that can outlast mood. It needs schedules, truthful information, cooperation, and a willingness to accept inconvenience for strangers. That institutional dimension protects Camus from a purely individualistic reading. Personal integrity matters, but plague is not defeated by private nobility alone. The response depends on coordinated action. Competence is ethical because mistakes travel from one body to another. Honesty is ethical because concealed risk prevents others from judging their situation. The common world is maintained through procedures that may feel impersonal but carry the accumulated care of many unknown people. Camus' ordinary heroes are not isolated rebels. They learn to become reliable participants. At the same time, the language of plague must be used carefully outside the novel. Calling a political enemy a disease can prepare the imagination for exclusion or eradication. Camus' allegory works because the plague represents a condition that threatens people across their differences, not a class of human beings declared contaminating. The ethical lesson is directed first toward the recurring human capacity for denial, domination, and indifference. It is not a license to classify unwanted neighbors as infection. The plague bacillus remains, and this ending prevents solidarity from becoming a victory myth. Human beings do not complete the work of vigilance once and for all. Institutions decay. Memory becomes ceremonial. A generation that did not experience the emergency may treat precautions as unnecessary burdens. Camus does not use recurrence to make effort futile. He uses it to remove the fantasy that goodness can be permanently secured. Care has to be renewed because danger can return. For a middle-aged listener, this may sound less bleak than it first appears. Much of adult responsibility already has this structure. A family is not sustained by one declaration of devotion. A craft is not mastered by one inspired day. A democracy is not preserved by one election. The valuable thing exists through repeated attention. The repetition can feel modest, even invisible, yet it is precisely what keeps a common life from collapsing into slogans. In the plague, solidarity is not a final answer to the absurd. It is what people build together because no final answer relieves them of one another. Part 9. When rebellion becomes revolution. Camus distinguishes rebellion from revolution without pretending that the words have always kept stable meanings. Rebellion begins in a concrete limit and remains tied to the value disclosed there. Revolution seeks to reorganize an entire political order, often through a theory of history. A rebellion may become revolutionary when it develops institutions and a program. The change is not automatically corrupt. It becomes dangerous when the program claims that history itself guarantees its truth. The rebel says that a particular humiliation cannot continue. The revolutionary may say that every present act must be judged by a future society in which humiliation will finally disappear. That future can become an invisible tribunal. Because it is perfect and not yet real, living people cannot question it. Sacrifice expands, criticism becomes betrayal, and murder is renamed necessity. Camus's target is the conversion of an uncertain struggle into a secular religion of salvation. He traces this temptation through a sweeping history of metaphysical and political rebellion. Figures from the Marquise de Sade to Russian nihilists, French revolutionaries, Hegel, Marx, and modern totalitarian movements enter the argument. The range is impressive and unstable. Camus often treats literary postures, philosophical systems, and state practices as stages in one drama. Connections that illuminate a moral pattern do not always establish historical causation. His history is an essayist's genealogy, not a neutral survey. The core warning concerns ends and means. If the end is held to be absolute, almost any means can appear temporary. A generation may be imprisoned or killed so that humanity can later be free. Camus refuses the arithmetic by which actual persons become fractions in a future total. The end is also shaped by the means used to pursue it. Institutions trained in secrecy, coercion, and contempt do not easily become transparent when victory arrives. This warning was directed especially at apologies for Stalinism on the post-war European left. Camus believed that opposition to capitalism or fascism could not excuse camps, show trials, censorship, and state killing. He suspected arguments that asked critics to remain silent so as not to aid a reactionary enemy. Truth divided for strategic convenience would cease to be truth. The writer's responsibility was to refuse official lies, even when the lie served a cause with emancipatory language. His opponents replied that this moral stance could ignore the violence already built into an unjust order. The law may look peaceful to those it protects while land, labor, and political voice have been taken from others. If the oppressed renounce force unilaterally, domination may simply continue. A demand for clean hands can become a luxury funded by other people's suffering. This objection became especially powerful in anti-colonial struggles, where the status quo was itself maintained by organized force. Camus's best answer is not that all violence is identical. It is that no violence becomes innocent through historical labeling. Defensive force and state terror differ in context, power, intention, and scale, but each act still needs judgment. He wanted necessity to remain an accusation, not a blessing. Even where force is judged unavoidable, those responsible should acknowledge the contradiction, minimize harm, protect civilians, accept scrutiny, and end coercion as soon as possible. This tragic ethic appears in his interest in Russian revolutionaries who accepted personal responsibility for violence and refused attacks that would kill children. Camus admired their limit and their willingness to risk themselves. Yet the example can become theatrical, focused on the moral drama of the actor more than the rights of those affected. Personal readiness to die does not by itself legitimate killing. Accountability must be public and political, not only a private test of sincerity. Rebellion and revolution, therefore, need each other as checks. Rebellion without durable organization may exhaust itself in gestures. Revolution without the rebel's original limit may harden into administration and terror. A defensible movement would institutionalize its capacity for self-correction, free speech, independent judgment, divided power, and protection even for opponents. Camus gestures toward this politics of relative goods, though he never fully designs it. Political form is therefore an ethical safeguard. Democratic procedure fits this account when it is understood as organized incompleteness. Elections can be reversed, courts can hear appeals, and opposition can expose error. None of these mechanisms guarantees justice, and majorities can violate rights. Their value lies partly in refusing a final political verdict. They allow conflict to continue without requiring one side's disappearance. Camus did not write a full theory of democracy, but his limits point toward institutions that keep power temporary and criticism possible. His distinction is valuable when treated as a diagnostic question, not an infallible classification. Has a movement remained answerable to the people whose dignity began it? Can its leaders admit uncertainty? Are present harms named in ordinary language? May insiders criticize the means without becoming enemies? Such questions bring the future back within human scale. They lead directly to Camus' confrontation with nihilism, where the hunger for total unity turns the absence of God into a license for organized murder. Part 10. Nihilism, History, and Political Murder. Nihilism has several meanings. It may describe the belief that no objective values exist, the mood that nothing matters, or the political wish to destroy an order without a binding account of what follows. Camus uses the term across these senses. He is less interested in a carefully bounded doctrine than in a movement of thought. Once transcendent authority collapses, human beings may either accept limits or attempt to occupy the vacant throne. The first path recognizes that our knowledge and power are finite. The second seeks to create on earth the unity once promised by heaven. If history is imagined as moving necessarily toward a final reconciliation, a party that claims to understand history can claim extraordinary authority. Opponents become remnants of a doomed past. Doubt becomes moral failure. Killing is presented as service to an inevitable future, even though the future itself cannot testify. Camus calls this logical crime, murder organized by an idea that treats its conclusion as certain. He is not saying that passionate or private violence is less terrible. He is identifying a modern capacity to administer harm without personal hatred. The official may feel virtuous because the victim has been converted into a category. Bureaucratic language lowers moral resistance. An execution, purge, or disappearance becomes a measure required by objective development. The atomic age enlarged the stakes. After the bombing of Hiroshima, Camus wrote in Combat that technical civilization had reached a new degree of savagery and that humanity faced a collective choice about its future. Nuclear weapons joined abstract strategy to the possible destruction of cities at a scale ordinary moral imagination struggles to hold. His response was not a technical doctrine of deterrence. It was a demand that political intelligence catch up with the power it had created. The rebel's historical argument is vulnerable here. Camus sometimes moves too quickly from German idealism to Marxism, and from Marx to Stalinist rule. Hegel's account of history, Marx's critique of capital, revolutionary organization, and totalitarian government are not interchangeable. Marxists have argued that Camus simplifies dialectical thought and neglects the coercion of capitalist and colonial systems. These are criticisms. Intellectual genealogies can become another way of blaming abstractions instead of examining institutions. Yet the moral mechanism he describes does recur beyond one ideology. Nations, empires, religious movements, security states, and revolutionary parties can all make necessity speak in their own accent. Each may divide violence into regrettable force used by us and criminal terror used by them. Camus's analysis gains durability when detached from a one-sided Cold War map. Its subject is the human wish to turn uncertainty into authorization. Political action cannot avoid prediction. A government estimates consequences. A movement chooses strategies. Citizens support laws whose effects are not fully known. Camus' idea of calculated ignorance begins from this condition. We act while admitting that our calculation can fail. Uncertainty does not prohibit decision. It limits the confidence with which we impose irreversible harm. The greater the uncertainty and the more final the act, the stronger the case for restraint. This helps explain his opposition to capital punishment. An execution makes a fallible judgment irreversible and gives the state a form of absolute authority. It also explains his defense of free expression. If no party possesses history's final truth, dissent is not an inconvenience to be removed. It is one of the means by which collective error becomes visible. Speech can harm, deceive, and dominate, but a system that forbids correction protects its own blindness. There remains an uncomfortable contradiction. To resist violent domination may require coercion, and refusing to act may assist the stronger side. Camus acknowledges that the rebel cannot promise never to lie or kill under every condition. At the same time, killing violates the solidarity from which revolt draws its authority. He does not solve the contradiction. He asks the actor to remain inside it, without purity and without excuse. Some critics regard this as evasion. A leader must decide, and a philosophy that only repeats the tragedy may offer little guidance. Others see restraint itself as practical guidance, prefer reversible measures, protect non-combatants, keep opposition legal, distribute power, disclose reasons, and judge means before the promised end arrives. These principles do not eliminate conflict. They make certainty harder to weaponize. Camus's answer to nihilism is therefore not a new absolute. It is fidelity to limits discovered in common vulnerability. He looks for a style of thought that can say yes and no together, yes to life, justice, and resistance, no to totality, humiliation, and authorized murder. He names this style measure and associates it with a Mediterranean inheritance of boundary, body, and balance. It remains a continuing practice of attention. Part 11. Limits, Measure, and the Mediterranean. Measure can sound like moderation in the weakest sense. Split the difference, avoid commitment, remain comfortable. Camus means something more demanding. Measure is the discipline of remaining within a contradiction that cannot honestly be dissolved. We need justice, but we do not possess perfect knowledge of justice. We need collective power, but power threatens the dignity that justified it. We must act, but action does not make us innocent. Measure preserves both sides so that neither becomes absolute. The word carries echoes of ancient Greek thought. Camus admired a culture he associated with form, proportion, nature, and recognition of human boundary. The mythic figure Nemesis punishes excess, not because every ambition is wrong, but because human beings forget their scale. In Camus' political language, measure opposes the modern dream of total mastery over nature and history. It asks what a project excludes, what it makes irreversible, and who bears its cost. He calls this orientation Mediterranean thought. Its recurring images are noon, sea, stone, the body, and a landscape where light draws clear edges. Northern Europe often appears as its contrast. Fog, abstraction, history, industry, and philosophies that subordinate nature to a future idea. The opposition gives lyrical force to his essays. It should not be mistaken for reliable cultural geography. Mediterranean societies have produced empires and absolutes. Northern societies have produced pluralism and restraint. The concept is most useful when separated from regional essence. Mediterranean measure then becomes a metaphor for embodied limitation. A body requires food, rest, care, and space. An ecosystem has thresholds. A legal institution has jurisdiction. A political office has a term. A friendship can make demands but not possess the whole person. Limits do not merely forbid. They create forms within which freedom becomes intelligible. Contemporary ecological thought gives this metaphor a further use, though Camus did not develop an environmental philosophy in current terms. A society cannot treat soil, water, climate, and living systems as infinitely available material. Recognition of physical thresholds resists fantasies of total production. The application must remain an interpretation, not a claim that Camus anticipated modern science. His contribution is an ethical posture. Mastery should answer to the finite world that makes action possible. Camus also distinguishes measure from compromise. Compromise trades between interests and may be wise or corrupt. Measure concerns the boundary beyond which an action contradicts its own reason. A movement founded on equal voice loses itself when it silences members. A court founded on fallible judgment exceeds itself when it imposes an irreversible penalty. A rebellion against dehumanization refutes itself when it treats a population as expendable. The limit arises from the affirmed value, not from timidity. This approach can support incremental reform, trade unionism, municipal action, and plural institutions. Camus showed sympathy for libertarian and syndicalist traditions that located power closer to workers and communities. He mistrusted centralized parties claiming exclusive historical insight. But decentralization is not automatically just. Local majorities can oppress minorities, and gradual change can preserve urgent suffering. Measure needs an account of power, rights, and speed that Camus only partly supplied in practice. The colonial problem exposes another weakness. To a settler who fears civil conflict, measure may mean coexistence and gradual reform. To a colonized person denied equal sovereignty, the same proposal may look like indefinite postponement. A call for balance between sides can hide the fact that one side controls the institutions. Limits are never politically neutral unless we ask who established them and whose freedom they restrict. Camus' language sometimes asks this question sharply and sometimes evades it. Even so, measure offers a useful alternative to moral perfectionism under sustained pressure. Human beings act with mixed motives, incomplete information, and limited endurance. A politics that requires purity will either paralyze itself or conceal impurity. Measured action expects error and builds correction into the process. It values apologies, appeals, elections, independent reporting, and the possibility of changing course. Its emblem is not the flawless hero, but the revisable decision. At the personal scale, measure protects finite goods from becoming idols. Work matters, but it cannot claim every hour. Love matters, but it cannot justify possession. Political commitment matters, but it cannot erase friendship with those who question it. Lucidity matters, but it can become pride. Camus's later fiction, especially The Fall, will expose how easily a public virtue becomes a private throne. Measure also shapes art. A work selects, orders, and limits the world while refusing to replace it. It rebels against formlessness by making a form, yet the best art leaves reality enough freedom to resist the artist's scheme. This balance between refusal and consent gives creation a central place in Camus' ethics. Measure is easily confused with moderation in the weak sense, as though Camus merely advised everyone to choose the middle option. His idea is more demanding. Measure begins when a person recognizes that a legitimate value can become destructive when it claims unlimited authority. Justice matters, but a justice that permits any cruelty in order to realize itself has contradicted the human dignity it was meant to defend. Freedom matters, but a freedom that recognizes no reciprocal limit becomes permission for the powerful. Order matters, but order without room for dissent becomes a quiet form of violence. The limit does not descend from a perfect rule that resolves every case. It is discovered in the presence of other people who can also say no. Rebellion begins with a boundary. This humiliation has gone too far. Yet the rebel's own action encounters another boundary in the humanity of the opponent and the uncertainty of consequences. The first no establishes a value, while the second prevents that value from becoming absolute. Political maturity lies in holding both boundaries at once. This makes measure frustrating for movements built around purity. Compromise can preserve injustice, and calls for patience are often spoken by those who benefit from delay. Camus knew that restraint could become an alibi for cowardice. Measure is not a refusal to choose. It is a refusal to pretend that choice abolishes ambiguity. One may have to resist forcefully while still naming the cost, protecting non-combatants, and leaving room for correction. The person of measure does not stand above conflict with clean hands. He or she enters conflict without worshipping it. Camus's Mediterranean imagery gives this ethical limit a sensory form. Sunlight reveals edges. The sea joins movement with boundary. The body has needs that no historical abstraction can permanently cancel. Friendship, beauty, fatigue, and mortality return thought to a scale at which individual lives cannot be treated as replaceable units. This imagery can be romanticized, especially when detached from the colonial history of the actual Mediterranean. It is most useful not as a geography of virtue, but as a reminder that political language must answer to embodied beings. Measure also applies to self-judgment. A person can turn moral seriousness into an unlimited prosecution of the self. Every compromise becomes proof of corruption, and every past mistake is retried without end. Such severity may look like conscience while preventing repair. If guilt becomes a complete identity, no particular restitution can matter. Camus's limit asks what responsibility requires now. It does not erase the past, but it prevents remorse from claiming a grandeur that belongs to action. In public life, measured speech resists two conveniences. The first is false equivalence, which treats every side as equally responsible regardless of evidence. The second is total innocence, which treats one's own side as exempt from scrutiny because its declared end is just. Measure compares actions, conditions, power, and consequence without collapsing differences. It permits strong judgment while refusing the dream of a position outside human fallibility. This ethic offers no guarantee of success. A restrained actor may lose to a ruthless one. A refusal to murder may fail to prevent murder. Camus accepts that morality cannot be proved by victory without surrendering morality to force. The worth of measure lies partly in the kind of world an action already creates. Means do not merely lead toward an end. They begin to give the end its character. A movement that trains people in secrecy, contempt, and obedience cannot assume that freedom will appear automatically after triumph. Measure therefore belongs beside revolt, not against it. It keeps rebellion faithful to the shared dignity from which rebellion first drew its authority. It asks the rebel to remain answerable to reality, including facts that inconvenience the cause and persons who cannot be reduced to categories. This is slower than certainty and less satisfying than innocence. It is also closer to the unfinished world in which action actually occurs. Part 12. Art as a Faithful Rebellion. Camus was never only an essayist of ideas. He wrote novels, stories, plays, journalism, and lyrical prose, worked as an actor and director, and treated artistic form as a way of thinking. Fiction allowed him to test claims that his essays stated too cleanly. Mere salt troubles the image of lucid innocence. Ryu shows solidarity without metaphysical comfort. Clemens reveals virtue turning into judgment. The work of art does not illustrate a settled doctrine. It gives contradiction room to speak. The notebooks reveal how deliberately these forms developed beside one another. Camus recorded scenes, phrases, plans, doubts, and paired cycles of work. The absurd cycle gathered the stranger, the myth of Sisyphus and Caligula. The revolt cycle included the plague, the rebel, and the just assassins. A novel, essay, and play could approach one problem through different pressures. The arrangement does not make each work a diagram. It shows an artist testing whether an idea survives changes of genre. Theatre was especially suited to limit and conflict. An actor's freedom is bounded by a role, a stage, other performers, and a duration. A political argument becomes embodied in voices that can interrupt one another. In The Just Assassins, revolutionaries debate whether a targeted killing can be carried out when children are present and what responsibility follows. The play does not make violence pure. It exposes the burden that abstract history tries to remove from the individual act. Creation begins with dissatisfaction. The world arrives unfinished, dispersed, and indifferent to our desire for unity. An artist selects a boundary, repeats a color, arranges events, or gives a voice a rhythm. In that sense, art rebels against brute contingency. It says that experience can take a form, yet the form is knowingly made. It does not claim to be the secret architecture of the universe. Camus contrasts this finite creation with propaganda and certain forms of pure formalism. Propaganda subordinates characters and facts to a predetermined verdict. Pure formalism can make technique indifferent to shared reality. He wants an art that neither copies the world mechanically nor escapes into a sealed design. The artist consents to part of reality and refuses another part, preserving enough tension that the work remains alive. This account closely resembles measure. A novel creates limits around time and perspective. Those limits make attention possible, but they also exclude. The stranger's narrow viewpoint produces its extraordinary style and its colonial silence. Form is never innocent. What an artist leaves unnamed can reveal an ethical boundary of the imagination. Criticism belongs inside fidelity to art because it asks what kind of world of form enables us to notice. Art also creates solidarity without requiring agreement. A reader temporarily inhabits a voice that is not the reader's own. This does not guarantee sympathy or virtue. Literature has served domination as well as freedom. But a work can complicate the categories through which official language administers people. It restores singular detail where ideology sees only types. Camus's preference for clarity aimed at this public function, even when his own clarity concealed exclusions. The artist's social responsibility was especially urgent after war. Camus rejected the fantasy of an artist untouched by history, but he also resisted the demand that every work become a party instrument. Commitment did not mean allowing an organization to determine permissible truth. The writer should stand near those subjected to history, tell what is known without distortion, and resist oppression. Those aims can conflict, and Camus' own political statements show how difficult impartial truth becomes when family and homeland are involved. There is humility in making rather than proclaiming. A play exists only through actors, space, timing, and an audience. A novel depends on readers who may understand it against the author's intention. Art enters a world of interpretations it cannot govern. This loss of control parallels Camus' political preference for pluralism. A creator provides a form but cannot possess every consequence of the form. Mortality gives artistic labor its absurd dimension. No book prevents death, completes justice, or secures its future audience. Creation continues without those guarantees. The act resembles Sisyphus only partially because works can accumulate, influence others, and outlive their makers. Yet cultural survival is also contingent. Art's value does not depend on immortality. A song heard once or a performance remembered by a few may still have joined separate moments of attention. Camus' view can seem too noble. Artists also seek status, money, control, and escape. Beautiful form can make violence attractive. The category of art tells us little without judgments about specific works and institutions. What survives is a practice of limited creation. Shape experience without claiming total explanation, remain answerable to what the shape excludes, and allow the audience freedom to answer back. This artistic ethic helps explain both Camus' friendship with Sartre and their rupture. Each believed writing should respond to history. Each defended freedom and opposed fascism. They disagreed about how an intellectual should judge revolutionary movements, communist power, and anti-colonial violence. Their quarrel turned philosophical differences into a public break, and later legend made the break simpler than it was. Part 13. Camus, Sartre, and Existentialism. Camus and Jean-Paul Sartre became friends in occupied Paris after each had already read and reviewed the other's work. They shared theatre, journalism, political conversation, and the intense public world that followed liberation. To readers abroad, both seem to represent a new French philosophy of freedom in an age without secure foundations. Their personal ease made the later quarrel feel like a symbolic divorce within the post-war left. Yet the intellectual differences were present before the friendship ended. Sartre's existentialism developed through technical accounts of consciousness, freedom, bad faith, and being with others. In a familiar summary, human beings have no predetermined essence and become what they make through situated choices. The summary should not erase Sartre's complexity. His freedom is always lived in a situation, and his later work increasingly addressed history, class, and collective action. Camus, by contrast, avoided systematic ontology. He began with a felt contradiction and asked what conduct could remain faithful to it. Their vocabularies overlapped. Both wrote about contingency, responsibility, authenticity, and a world without divine guarantee. Both believed that refusing choice is itself consequential. Sartre's early essay on the stranger helped define the novel's reception and clarified the relation between Camus's fiction and the absurd. Still, Camus objected to being absorbed into a school. He thought some existential thinkers discovered meaninglessness only to escape it through God, essence, or history. Sartre, in Camus' later criticism, risked making history the source of a new secular absolute. The political distance widened after the war. Sartre moved toward closer engagement with Marxism while retaining a complicated independence from the Communist Party. He believed that intellectual judgment had to begin from structures of exploitation and the real alignment of political forces. Camus became increasingly defined by opposition to Soviet repression, revolutionary terror, and the excuses made for them. He feared that strategic solidarity with communism required silence about victims whose deaths did not fit the desired history. The immediate rupture followed the rebel. Francis Janssen reviewed the book critically in Sartre's journal Les Temps Moderns in 1952. Janssen challenged its historical competence, its treatment of Marxism, and what he saw as a politics detached from the conditions of oppression. Camus answered in a letter addressed formally to the journal's director, effectively making Sartre responsible. Sartre replied at length and with personal severity. The exchange ended a friendship of roughly a decade. It is tempting to cast Camus as the humane opponent of murder and Sartre as the cynical defender of any revolutionary violence. That portrait is false. Sartre's politics changed, contained tensions, and included forceful opposition to colonial domination and torture. Camus had participated in resistance and knew that refusing force under every circumstance could assist tyranny. Their disagreement concerned where complicity lay, which violence and intellectual risked minimizing, and whether universal moral limits could be separated from historical power. Sartre's side posed a question Camus never fully answered. If an existing order rests on conquest and force, what does a demand for restraint mean to those compelled to live under it? The privileged can describe stability as peace. A formal prohibition on violence may freeze an unequal distribution of land, law, and voice. Universal ethics must therefore analyze structure, not only individual acts. Otherwise, the condemnation of rebellion can be more exact than the condemnation of the system that provoked it. Camus's side posed an equally durable question. If history explains violence, when does explanation become permission? A movement may begin among the oppressed and still reproduce prisons, hierarchy, and official falsehood. Intellectuals who postpone criticism until after victory may find that the machinery of suppression has become the victory. The dignity of future people cannot be purchased with an unlimited claim over people now alive. Their disagreement also involved temperament and literary method. Sartre trusted conceptual analysis and increasingly comprehensive historical interpretation. Camus trusted image, immediate moral perception, and the correction supplied by limits. Sartre could regard Camus' measure as politically evasive. Camus could regard Sartre's historical reasoning as a machine that made the victim disappear. Each identified a genuine danger in the other, and each sometimes reduced the other to that danger. The dispute left Camus intellectually isolated from much of the Parisian left. Later revelations about Stalinist crimes made some of his warnings appear prescient, but vindication on that point does not settle every dispute. Anti-communism can itself become ideological, and Camus' focus on Soviet violence could be selective. Sartre's anti-colonial commitments exposed realities that Camus' language of balance often softened. History did not award one friend complete innocence. The most accurate classification is therefore relational. Camus belongs in conversation with existentialism because he shares its questions and shaped its public world. He is not a conventional existentialist because he rejected the label, avoided its systematic projects, and developed an ethic centered on absurdity, revolt, and measure. The border is intellectually useful. It keeps resemblance from becoming identity. The quarrel's deepest test arrived not in Paris but in Algeria. There, Sartre supported independence and attacked colonialism as a system. Camus condemned colonial injustice, yet could not accept a national future that might expel or endanger the European civilian community to which his mother belonged. His effort to protect every life met a political order that had never protected lives equally. The difference now involved a homeland already under war. The disagreement between Camus and Sartre matters because it reveals two different ways of connecting intellectual responsibility with political history. Both men rejected a comfortable neutrality that simply protects the existing order. Both understood that occupation, colonial violence, economic inequality, and political repression made withdrawal morally consequential. Yet they differed over how far a thinker could support a movement whose promised liberation was joined to present coercion. Sartre was more willing, during important periods, to judge communist politics within the strategic pressures of historical struggle. Camus feared that this approach allowed an imagined future to absorb the lives sacrificed in the present. Their public break is often narrated as a contest with a winner. One version treats Sartre as the politically serious thinker and Camus as a moralist who refused history. Another treats Camus as the clear-sighted defender of limits and Sartre as an apologist for terror. Both versions flatten changes in their positions and the pressures under which they wrote. Sartre criticized Soviet repression and revised political alliances. Camus's language of measure did not always provide a practical path through colonial conflict, especially in Algeria. Intellectual honesty requires allowing each man to expose a weakness in the other. Sartre's challenge is that moral cleanliness can become a privilege. A person who refuses every compromised collective action may leave existing violence undisturbed while preserving a private sense of innocence. Camus's challenge is that commitment can become a machine for excusing whatever serves the chosen direction of history. A movement may demand silence about prisons, executions, or lies because criticism supposedly assists a worse enemy. The first danger is ineffective purity. The second is effective betrayal. Political judgment often occurs between them. The friendship adds emotional depth to the argument. Public controversy was not merely an exchange of propositions. Admiration, rivalry, wounded loyalty, editorial decisions, and the expectations of post-war intellectual culture all shaped the encounter. This does not reduce ideas to personality. It reminds us that thinkers argue through human relationships, and that a theoretical dispute can harden when each person begins defending an identity before an audience. Once Camus became the symbol of moral limits and Sartre the symbol of historical engagement, concession threatened more than a single claim. Their disagreement also clarifies why Camus resisted the existentialist label. He shared themes associated with existentialism: a world without guaranteed meaning, the burden of choice, the refusal of abstract consolation, and attention to lived experience. But he distrusted philosophies that seemed to make human freedom the source of all value, or to place history inside a total explanatory frame. His Absurd begins with a relation that freedom cannot simply master. The world resists the projects through which consciousness tries to organize it. For contemporary readers, the useful inheritance is not a permanent choice between Team Camus and Team Sartre. It is a double question. When does refusal of compromise protect actual people, and when does it protect only the refuser's self-image? When does solidarity with a cause make action possible, and when does it forbid truthful description of what the cause has become? No slogan answers these questions in advance. They require evidence, comparison, and the courage to disappoint one's own side. The broken friendship leaves a quiet warning about political identity. If every criticism from a friend is heard as assistance to an enemy, friendship itself becomes impossible. Camus' ethics of limits suggests that alliances should contain room for internal refusal. Sartre's ethics of engagement reminds us that refusal must still reckon with consequence. Held together, these demands form a more difficult standard than either public camp usually allowed. Part 14. Algeria and the Limits of Universalism. Algeria was not merely Camus' birthplace or a store of Mediterranean images. France had invaded in 1830 and developed a settler colony in which land, citizenship, representation, education, and economic power were distributed through racial and legal hierarchy. By Camus' lifetime, families of European origin could be poor and politically privileged at once. These facts are not contradictory. Poverty describes material condition, colonial status describes a position within an unequal order. Camus' own family made the complexity intimate. His mother's life in Belcourt was marked by hard work, limited money, disability, and vulnerability. She was not a distant owner directing an empire. Yet the state counted her within the European citizen population and did not grant most Muslim Algerians equal membership on the same terms. Camus knew the first truth through love and memory. He knew the second through journalism and politics, but never integrated the two with equal imaginative force. His reporting on Kabylia in 1939 remains morally significant. He documented hunger, low wages, inadequate schooling, and administrative neglect among Kabyle communities. He argued for material reform and treated suffering ignored by the colonial press as a public scandal. After the violence and severe repression surrounding Sétif and neighboring areas in 1945, his journalism again warned that France could not demand loyalty while denying justice. These interventions required courage and contradicted complacent colonial opinion. They also reveal the boundary of his position. Camus generally sought equality, reform, and a plural Algerian community still associated with France. He did not move from evidence of systemic domination to support for full national independence. His political imagination remained attached to a shared homeland where European and Arab communities might coexist without expulsion. This attachment was humane toward civilians who feared displacement. It was also unable to grant sufficient weight to the colonized majority's claim to sovereignty. The Algerian War began in 1954 with attacks by the National Liberation Front and an escalating French military response. Violence spread through bombings, assassinations, reprisals, torture, detention, and attacks on civilians. Camus condemned both insurgent terrorism and state repression. In January 1956, he returned to Algiers and publicly appealed for a civilian truce. At minimum, he asked every side to spare non-combatants, even while the political conflict continued. The appeal expressed the principle at the center of the rebel. No future justice could make the deliberate killing of civilians just. Camus entered a hostile atmosphere and asked for a limit that seemed almost impossibly narrow. The proposal did not pretend to settle sovereignty. It tried to preserve the human community within which any settlement would have meaning. As a moral intervention, its refusal to classify innocent deaths by faction retains force. As politics, however, the truce treated violence too symmetrically. French rule was not one faction among equals. It possessed the army, police, prisons, legal authority, and a long history of dispossession. The National Liberation Front also committed grave violence, including against Algerian rivals and civilians, but its violence arose within a struggle against an established colonial state. To judge acts fairly does not require making their political positions identical. Camus' public language often named immediate cruelty more clearly than structural domination. His defenders note that he supported reforms, condemned torture, appealed for clemency for condemned Algerian nationalists, and rejected the racism of many settlers. They also stress that he feared a nationalist state might endanger ordinary Pieds Noirs and suppress plural identities. These concerns were not invented as a pretext. Independent struggles, like states, can contain authoritarian currents. Acknowledging the concern does not show that continued French sovereignty was legitimate or politically viable. His critics answer that attachment to coexistence became a way of withholding the decisive right of self-government. European Algerians were asked to imagine danger. Colonized Algerians had lived under coercion for generations. Proposals for federation and gradual reform arrived after repeated failures of equal citizenship. Measure, viewed from below, could look like patience demanded by those who had more time and power. The moral wish to save all lives did not supply a strategy for ending the order that valued them unequally. The controversy sharpened after Camus received the Nobel Prize. At a public exchange in Stockholm, an Algerian student challenged him about his relative silence. Camus' unscripted response has often been compressed into a choice between justice and his mother. In context, he was speaking about terrorism that might strike civilians, including his mother, and rejecting an abstract justice that permitted such killing. The statement expressed a legitimate refusal to sacrifice a loved one to a slogan. It also revealed whose vulnerability occupied his imagination first. Camus later withdrew from frequent public comment on the war, believing that his words were being used by opposing camps and perhaps hoping to work privately for lives at risk. Silence can be restraint when speech inflames danger. For a celebrated writer, silence can also preserve the asymmetry of the existing order within a national political crisis. There is no perspective outside consequence. Speaking and withholding speech both enter history. His fiction intensifies the criticism. In The Stranger, the murdered Arab remains unnamed. In The Plague, the colonized population of Oran scarcely inhabits the collective whose suffering the novel universalizes. In the story The Guest, an Arab prisoner again lacks a personal name, even though the story carefully renders the moral difficulty of the European schoolteacher Daru. These choices do not erase the work's insight. They show the limit of a universal humanism whose representative individuals are unevenly imagined. The unfinished autobiographical novel The First Man, published decades after Camus' death, deepens both sides of the record. It gives loving detail to poor settler families, to a silent mother, and to people who felt rootless before official French culture. It also imagines Algeria through settler memory in ways critics argue can leave indigenous history as a surrounding absence. The manuscript's unfinished state requires caution, but its emotional center clarifies why political separation felt to Camus like the loss of a home, not merely a policy change. Some scholars today still describe Camus as a colonial writer. Others emphasize his anti-colonial criticism and defense of an inclusive Algeria. A more adequate judgment may resist both acquittal and simple dismissal. He opposed many cruelties of colonialism, rejected racial contempt, and wanted political equality. He also remained attached to a settler claim and did not endorse the independence movement that dismantled French rule. His universalism was sincere and compromised. This compromise matters philosophically. Camus argues that revolt discovers a common dignity and that no group may turn others into means. Colonial Algeria asks whether that dignity can be honored without transferring power. It asks whether a limit protects persons or protects an arrangement. It asks whose description of violence becomes universal. On these questions, his principles exceed his politics. They support a stronger criticism of colonial rule than he himself was willing to make. Algeria became independent in 1962, 2 years after Camus died in a car accident. We cannot know how he would have responded to the final settlement, the departure of most Pieds Noirs, or the later course of the Algerian state. Counterfactual reconciliation is too easy. The historical record is enough. Compassion, fear, insight, attachment, and political limitation existed together. To preserve Camus' value, we do not need to erase this failure. His philosophy itself teaches suspicion toward claims of innocence. A reader can apply his demand for limits to colonial state power, his solidarity to people he insufficiently represented, and his refusal of abstraction to the material history of conquest. Criticism then becomes a form of serious inheritance. It refuses both the execution of the writer and the pardon that asks no questions. The same demand for fallible justice appears where Camus was least ambiguous: capital punishment. There he confronted the state's claim to kill, not amid battle or revolution, but through deliberate legal procedure. His argument against the guillotine makes measure, institutional, and irreversible judgment its clearest enemy. Part 15. Justice without the guillotine. Camus' opposition to capital punishment runs through The Stranger, The Plague, journalism, petitions, and the 1957 essay Reflections on the Guillotine. He begins the essay with a family memory. His father once attended a public execution expecting to see justice done, returned home shaken, and became physically ill. Camus uses the incident to separate the dignified language of punishment from the act the language conceals. His case is moral, political, and practical. Execution is not a spontaneous crime answered in kind. It is prepared by institutions, scheduled, guarded, and carried out after the condemned person has lived under its anticipation. Retribution claims an equivalence it cannot achieve. The state repeats killing under conditions of greater calculation, then calls the repetition justice. For Camus, law should restrain vengeance, not perfect its machinery. He also challenges deterrence. If public terror were the point, executions would need to be displayed. Modern states had moved them behind prison walls, indicating their own discomfort with the spectacle. Evidence and comparisons available to him did not establish the promised preventive effect. Even if a penalty deterred some crime, a fallible institution would still need to justify an irreversible act. Utility does not erase error. Error is decisive because courts are human. Evidence is incomplete, witnesses fail, prejudice operates, and political climates change. A prison sentence may be reviewed and partly repaired. An execution cannot. Camus asks justice to know its infirmity. The humility is not softness toward harm. A society may confine dangerous people and punish serious crimes while refusing to place itself beyond correction. His argument also concerns equality. Severe punishment falls within social structures already marked by poverty and unequal power. The state judges an offender as though the state itself stood innocent outside the conditions it governs. Camus does not deny personal responsibility. He denies that public imperfection grants public authority an absolute right over life. A limited state should not claim a theological final judgment after its theological foundations have faded. This connects reflections on the guillotine to the rebel. Execution is the point where an institution says no further appeal, no possible transformation, no remainder beyond the condemned act. It reduces a person to a verdict and makes death an administrative instrument. Abolition places a boundary around government. The person remains responsible, but the state remains responsible too. Arguments for capital punishment have not disappeared. Defenders appeal to retribution, incapacitation, public safety, and the gravity of particular crimes. Families of victims may experience abolitionist language as attention redirected toward the offender. A humane rejection of execution must not minimize their loss or prescribe forgiveness. Camus's strongest response is institutional. Grief deserves care and justice, but no individual grief can make a fallible state infallible. He hoped that a future Europe would make abolition a foundational rule. France abolished the death penalty in 1981, and European human rights institutions later made abolition central to membership. This later history does not prove every part of Camus' reasoning, but it shows that the limit he proposed could become law, not remain a private moral gesture. Capital punishment brings the documentary's two refusals together. Physical suicide removes the self from the absurd relation. Execution removes another person through a judgment claiming final authority. Camus rejects both closures, though for different reasons and with different responsibilities. Life is left open because human knowledge is not complete and because a person cannot be exhausted by one description. That conviction becomes less confident in Camus' late fiction. The Fall examines a man who turns confession into a new form of power. Exile and the Kingdom places characters near moments of connection that remain ambiguous. Here the philosopher of Revolt becomes the novelist of compromised innocence. The next stories ask whether anyone can confess, withdraw, or choose freely without also becoming entangled once more in another person's fate and judgment. Part 16. The Fall, Exile, and Compromised Innocence. The Fall, published in 1956, is a monologue delivered in Amsterdam by Jean-Baptiste Camus, a former Paris lawyer. He speaks to a mostly silent companion in a bar called Mexico City. Charming, learned, and attentive, he gradually recounts the collapse of his admired self-image. The setting lies among canals and low horizons, far from Camus' sunlit Mediterranean. Camus calls himself a judge penitent, someone who confesses in order to gain the right to judge everyone else. In Paris, he had performed generosity with ease. He defended worthy causes, assisted strangers, and enjoyed the reflection of his goodness in other people's eyes. The acts may have helped, but their secret audience was himself. One night, after passing a woman on a bridge, he heard a body enter the water and continued walking. Later, a sound like laughter pursued him. The incident revealed the distance between his public virtue and his willingness to be interrupted by another life. Camus's confession does not restore humility. By declaring himself guilty of everything, he makes guilt universal. If no one is innocent, he can accuse his listener while appearing to accuse himself. Confession becomes a technique of superiority. He descends first so that he can occupy the judge's seat below. The novel shows how lucidity can become vanity, and how the rhetoric of shared fault can obscure differences in action and power. This is a powerful internal criticism of Camus' moral voice. The essayist who denounces ideological murder may begin to enjoy the purity of denunciation. The public intellectual may help victims and still use their suffering as evidence of personal courage. The advocate of measure may judge opponents from an unacknowledged height. Clemens is not a coded transcription of Camus, Sartre, or any one person. He is a composite mirror in which a whole moral generation, including Camus, can appear. The novel also complicates solidarity. To say that everyone shares guilt can create compassion, since no one stands entirely outside failure. It can also flatten responsibility. The person who walks past suffering and the person who causes it are not guilty in the same way. Clemens's universal confession avoids this accounting. Camus makes the evasion audible through the seduction of the voice. The reader is drawn into agreement and then notices the trap. Exile and the Kingdom, published the following year, gathers 6 stories about separation, desire, labor, faith, art, and uncertain belonging. The title's opposition is not resolved by assigning each character to one side. A kingdom may be a moment of contact within exile, and a desired escape may deepen isolation. Camus' late style allows gestures to remain incomplete as well. The characters seldom receive the clear consciousness granted to Sisyphus. In The Adulterous Woman, Janine travels with her husband through an Algerian landscape and experiences a nocturnal release from the narrowness of her life. The title directs suspicion, but the decisive event is not a conventional affair. It is an encounter with distance, body, and a possibility she cannot bring back into marriage. The story's lyrical beauty is also entangled with an exoticized colonial setting where local lives remain at the edge of her awakening. The Silent Men quietly follows a small group of barrel makers returning to work after a failed strike. Their silence toward the employer carries injury, pride, and class defeat. No metaphysical speech repairs the relation. Labor creates a community, but hierarchy governs the terms of labor. Camus' sympathy for workers appears in restrained detail. Measure here is not a centrist settlement. It is the difficult preservation of dignity after collective power has failed. The Renegade, or a confused spirit, is the collection's harshest and most fevered voice. A missionary seeks absolute authority over people he imagines converting, is captured and brutalized, then transfers his worship to cruelty itself. The monologue entangles religious domination, colonial fantasy, resentment, and the wish to be ruled by a single truth. Because the narrator is unstable and the setting stylized, the story resists direct doctrine. It nevertheless shows how the hunger for purity can reverse allegiance without surrendering its structure. Jonas, or the artist at work, portrays a painter whose success fills his home with visitors, demands, and interpretations. He withdraws into a cramped loft to recover the solitude of creation. The final sign he leaves can be read as solitary or solidary, depending on a small ambiguity in the word. Camus refuses to decide whether art requires separation from others or fidelity to them. The artist lives between both needs. The Growing Stone moves to Brazil, where the engineer Deraste becomes involved in another man's religious promise and communal burden. Rather than remain a detached European observer, he eventually helps carry a stone and places it within a human gathering. The scene suggests a kingdom created through shared weight, not domination. Yet the story still arrives through a European protagonist. Connection occurs briefly, but the inherited perspective does not disappear. The Guest is the collection's most direct colonial parable. Daru, a school teacher on an isolated Algerian plateau, is ordered to deliver an Arab prisoner to the authorities. He resents both the command and the prisoner's alleged act. He feeds the man, gives him money and a choice of paths, then watches him walk toward the prison rather than toward possible freedom. Returning to the school, Daru finds a threat accusing him of handing over a brother. Every position in the story is compromised. Daru wants neutrality, but his school, supplies, and authority belong to the colonial system. Giving the prisoner a choice seems respectful, yet it transfers the weight of a coercive situation onto a man whose name and history remain unavailable. The prisoner's decision resists easy interpretation. The threatening message judges Daru by a political identity he hoped not to occupy. Solitude is not an exit from history. Post-colonial criticism rightly asks why the Arab character remains unnamed and largely unreadable, while Daru's conscience receives depth. A defender may say that opacity protects the prisoner from Daru's interpretation. Even so, the distribution of interiority follows a repeated pattern in Camus' Algerian fiction. The colonized person becomes the test of a European moral crisis. The story reveals colonial impossibility and reproduces part of its imaginative inequality. These late works are valuable because they do not let Camus' philosophy rest in noble formulas. Clemens turns solidarity into accusation. Daru turns refusal into impossible neutrality. Jonas cannot settle solitude and service. Janine's liberation depends on a landscape viewed through inherited distance. The kingdom is glimpsed, not possessed. Moral awareness arrives with residue. This is perhaps a more credible model of mind than the sovereign absurd hero. We are not fully transparent to ourselves. Good actions carry vanity. Refusals carry consequence. Attention is distributed by history before we choose. Freedom survives, but as a revisable practice among others. The late fiction brings Camus close to an ethics of self-suspicion that his political essays often needed. From these compromised figures, we can now return to the opening question. Camus has offered no system that guarantees a life without meaning will be good, and no rule that makes resistance innocent. His legacy lies in a sequence of disciplined refusals, each valuable, each open to correction. The fall deepens Camus' suspicion of moral performance by giving us a speaker who can turn confession into mastery. Clemens appears to expose himself without mercy. He names vanity, cowardice, indifference, and the secret pleasure of judging others. Yet the confession gradually encloses the listener. If every generous act conceals self-love and every claim to innocence hides guilt, then no response can escape his system. Agreement confirms his insight. Disagreement proves the listener's dishonesty. Confession has become a courtroom in which the accused also controls the law. This is why the novel remains useful in an age of public self-disclosure. Admission can repair trust when it is specific, proportionate, and joined to changed conduct. It can also become a performance that recenters the person who caused harm. The confessor displays unusual insight, receives attention for complexity, and invites others to admire the courage of the admission. What is missing may be the ordinary work of apology. Listening to the injured person, accepting limits on one's role, restoring what can be restored, and living without control over forgiveness. Clemens's universal guilt contains a similar evasion. If everyone is guilty in the same way, particular responsibility loses its shape. The person who failed to act beside the river can dissolve that event into a theory of the human condition. A universal truth then protects him from the unequal facts of a specific night. Camus does not deny shared imperfection. He shows how easily it can be used to blur differences between hesitation, neglect, exploitation, and deliberate cruelty. The setting in Amsterdam reinforces the moral atmosphere. Canals, fog, enclosed circles, and the memory of the drowned woman replace the open light often associated with Camus' Mediterranean imagination. But the contrast is not simply between a guilty north and an innocent south. By the time of the fall, innocence itself has become suspect. The question is whether a person can acknowledge compromise without making compromise the final truth of human relation. Exile offers one answer. Exile in Camus is geographical, political, emotional, and metaphysical. A person can be separated from a homeland, from a community, from an earlier self, or from the imagined unity of the world. The desire to end exile can lead toward solidarity, but it can also lead toward coercive belonging. A nation promises unity by silencing internal difference. A movement promises historical homecoming by expelling those who complicate the story. A relationship promises complete understanding and then punishes privacy. Camus keeps the ache of exile visible without allowing it to justify every home that claims to cure it. Compromised innocence may be the mature condition of his ethics. We act from mixed motives, inherit unjust arrangements, and discover consequences we did not intend. None of this makes judgment impossible. It changes judgment from a declaration of purity into a comparative and revisable practice. We ask who had power, what alternatives were available, what harm occurred, what was known, and what repair remains possible. We judge without pretending that the judge is untouched by the world being judged. There is humility in this, but not moral fog. Camus uses complexity to make everyone captive. Camus uses complexity to make responsibility more exact. The difference lies in whether analysis returns to action. A confession that ends in fascination with the confessor remains a closed circle. A confession that accepts consequence may open a path beyond it. The final challenge of the fall is therefore intimate. Can a person tell the truth about vanity without becoming vain about truthfulness? Can one admit cowardice without turning cowardice into a permanent identity? Can one judge injustice while remaining alert to the pleasures of judgment? There is no technique that guarantees success. The questions must be renewed in conduct, conversation, and the willingness to be corrected. That willingness is a form of exile from innocence, but it may also be the beginning of a more honest companionship. Part 17. Objections, Legacy, and Measured Action. The strongest objection to Camus is logical. He begins with a universe that supplies no guaranteed meaning, then affirms life, dignity, solidarity, and limits. The transition is not demonstrated as firmly as his language sometimes suggests. Shared rebellion can disclose a value without proving it universal. His answer is practical and phenomenological. When people resist degradation, they experience something worth defending in common. That answer may ground an ethic, but it does not compel every skeptic. A second objection is political. Limits can restrain liberators more effectively than established powers. Without analysis of property, empire, race, and institutions, moral symmetry can freeze unequal conditions. Algeria makes this criticism unavoidable. Camus' principles opposed humiliation, torture, collective punishment, and civilian killing. His political proposals did not adequately confront the colonized majority's demand to end French sovereignty. The distance between principle and application belongs inside his legacy. A third objection concerns voice. Camus' clarity can make contested judgments sound self-evident. Philosophical suicide compresses religious and phenomenological thinkers. The rebel compresses difficult histories into a moral genealogy. The masculine universal language of his period often leaves gendered experience unexamined. His fiction sometimes restores ambiguity, but its distribution of names and inner lives reflects colonial limits. Lucidity itself must be questioned, clear for whom and at whose expense. What remains persuasive is his refusal to let uncertainty become permission. The absence of eternal law does not make a person disposable. A just cause does not cleanse every method. A state's legal ritual does not make killing morally pure. A writer's confession does not confer innocence. These are negative claims, but together they create space for plural life. They favor reversible decisions, truthful speech, protection of civilians, abolition of final penalties, and institutions able to correct themselves. Camus also preserves ordinary action from the demand for total success. Reuse work matters, although plague can return. Art matters, although no form completes reality. Friendship matters without becoming eternal. Revolt matters without transforming the rebel into a spotless hero. This modesty is not passivity. It asks for sustained labor under conditions where applause and final victory cannot be promised. Its discipline is to begin again without claiming redemption beforehand. The central question can now be answered only in a qualified way. We live fully without guaranteed meaning by refusing to treat the missing guarantee as a verdict. We give attention to finite goods, create forms, tell the truth we can verify, and join others against preventable suffering. We refuse suicide as a supposed deduction from cosmic silence. We refuse political murder as a supposed deduction from historical certainty. When danger requires action, we accept responsibility without worshipping necessity. Much remains doubtful. Camus never proves that revolt must become universal solidarity. Measure does not calculate every emergency. His criticism of violence needs a stronger account of structural force. His love of Algeria did not become an adequate politics of decolonization. A mature inheritance keeps these failures near the insights. It does not need a flawless Camus, because his best work teaches that the search for flawless innocence is itself dangerous. In ordinary life, measured action may appear less dramatic than philosophy. It can mean leaving a decision open to appeal, hearing the person whom a tidy story excludes, refusing a useful lie, sharing repetitive care, or limiting an authority we happen to trust. None of these gestures answers why the universe exists. They answer another question: what kind of presence we can offer while we are here? The world remains silent about its final purpose. Around that silence are mortal voices, unfinished work, and boundaries no person sees alone. We may continue without turning the stone into a blessing or the mountain into a destiny. At evening, the day's labor rests where it has reached, and beside it there is still room for another pair of hands.